Hello again, everyone. Mr. Lewis here, ready to continue our discussion on industrial development in AP Human Geography today as we take a look at Section 8 of Unit 8, Global Trade Patterns. And when we last spoke, global trade was booming. We've moved into the period of globalization, and with it, massive economic growth. We find that more countries are trading on an international level than ever before in world history. But with this change, we also want to make sure that the rules of international trade are written somewhere. And so all these different groups start to form, like the World Trade Organization, which regulates trade between hundreds of different countries around the world, even up through today. Or smaller, more regional organizations like the European Union are formed. The EU was created to open up trade and to make trade cheaper by getting rid of tariffs among European countries. Finally, we have the creation of a very important trade bloc, a supranationalist organization called OPEC, which stands for the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. Now, OPEC is formed in 1960 by Iraq, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Venezuela. And what these countries realized is that on their own, on a global scale, they might only have so much influence, only so much power. But by coming together, and because they're all very oil wealthy countries and control this very important resource, they'll have more of a say on the global scale. They'll have more influence in international affairs. And so today, OPEC has grown to more than a dozen countries around the world, which collectively drill for about 42% of the oil produced on a daily basis around the globe. And in terms of oil reserves, so not necessarily oil that's being drilled for on a day-to-day basis or oil that's being pumped on a day-to-day basis, but oil that's proven to be in the ground and could likely be extracted at some point. OPEC countries control almost 80% of the world's oil. So, this is a very powerful organization made up of mostly semi-periphery and periphery countries who realized because of this resource wealth, they can influence core countries. Now, how do you use this influence? Well, for one, you could increase the supply of oil, therefore driving the price of it down. You could decrease the supply of oil, therefore driving the price up. And if the price of oil goes up, the price of gas is going to go up and people are going to be losing their minds. Those are just two examples. Controlling such an important resource and one that is so significant in industrial development gives this group a lot of power. How they use that power has changed throughout time. And if you'd like to see a few examples, go ahead and watch this clip below and take a look at, over the last 50 years, how OPEC has made use of this resource wealth. But moving forward, it's not just OPEC. There are many countries around the world that are, in their own right, oil giants, energy giants. The United States, in some years, is actually the number one country around the world in terms of oil production. Russia sometimes takes that crown. Russia is always in the top 3 of crude oil production. They also produce a ton of natural gas, and together, oil and gas make up over 50% of Russia's export economy. Finally, our neighbors to the north, Canada, are very oil rich as well. Specifically, in the province of Alberta, they have this area known as the tar sands. The tar sands represent an oil basin, and this oil is very heavy, it's very dirty, and so over time it's become referred to as the tar sands. But it's created quite an economic boom for the oil industry in Canada. Now, the question becomes, if the United States is such a dominant oil producer, then why do we still import over $100 billion worth of crude petroleum each year? If we have so much on our own, why do we import so much of it? Well, the fact is, we consume a lot of this stuff. You can see from this bar graph here that the United States is the top oil consumer in the entire world, even more than China, although China is an industrialized nation, or I should say rapidly industrializing, and they have over 3 times as many people as the United States. The United States still consumes more oil. And so we consume a lot of this stuff, and we have to buy a lot of it. And even though we could probably produce even more crude oil than we do, one, a lot of those lands are protected. 2, there are other resources that we have and other industries we have that can produce even greater profits. And this is what's known as a comparative advantage. Complementarity and comparative advantage refer to a situation in which 2 countries trade with one another because it just fits. It works out well. What we have is what they want, and what they have is what we want. It's kind of like, although you should never do this, it's kind of like if you were really good at English and your friend was really good at math, and you said, okay, you do the math homework and I'll do the English homework, and then we'll trade. It's going to save us time, it's efficient, and we're doing what we're best at. Now, that'd be cheating, and you shouldn't do that because it's wrong. However, this is kind of how international trade works. This is the process of complementarity and comparative advantage. A real example might look something like this. We want oil, and you have a lot of oil, and you want copper, and we have a lot of copper, and so we should trade with one another because we have the natural resource that you want, and you have the natural resource that we want. And so we can produce these things at lower cost. This gives us a comparative advantage in that particular industry. It might be because of climate. It might be because of what naturally exists in the earth. It might be because of technology or education or specialization. But these 2 forces, complementarity and comparative advantage, oftentimes help determine which items countries are going to trade with one another, or in some cases, which countries are trading with one another to begin with. Some examples of comparative advantages that exist around the world are listed here. Crude petroleum. The largest exporter of crude petroleum is Saudi Arabia. It's an abundant natural resource, and they've specialized their education and their economic infrastructure over the years to take advantage of this natural resource. The United States, on the other hand, is the largest exporter of refined petroleum, crude petroleum that has been refined and is now usable in some way. And a big reason for this is not only the fact that we have a lot of crude oil that can be refined, but also because of some of the technology that we've developed in the United States, the talented engineers and scientists that we have who have specialized and dedicated their efforts to making oil cleaner and more efficient and more effective over the years. And so we've gotten very good at producing refined petroleum. It's a comparative advantage for the United States. Another comparative advantage for the United States is agricultural products. We are the largest exporter of agricultural goods around the world. A big reason for this is not just technology and agricultural mechanization, automation, commercialization, but also the amount of land that we have and the climate that surrounds much of that land. So the landscape itself, the physical geography of the United States, lends itself to the agricultural industry. Australia, you can see up here, is the world's leading exporter of coal, which was one of the reasons that the United Kingdom, that the British Empire initially expressed interest in Australia because of their rich natural resources, coal, iron, among other things. But it's important to note that coal, even today, generates most of the electricity in the United States. So very important resource even up through today, not just going back to Industrial Revolution England. Now, in some cases, the comparative advantage for a country lies within its population. If the population is large enough and if wages are low enough, this may draw the interest of transnational corporations who are seeking cheaper employment than what they may be able to find in their home country. This is what we refer to as outsourcing, when a company looks to a foreign country to hire workers. Now, for the country itself, this is great because it's going to improve employment rates. It's going to improve average wealth and average income for people in some of these periphery or even semi-periphery countries. However, it does raise questions regarding whether or not those wages are fair. And this kind of gets into Wallerstein's model of core, semi-periphery, and periphery countries. We know that core countries are selling goods to not just people in the core nations, but also semi-periphery and periphery, and making lots of money doing it. But we also found out that from these semi-periphery and periphery countries, the core countries, more specifically the companies within core nations, are getting raw materials and cheap labor. And so questions have to be asked about whether or not this is fair for those laborers, whether or not these companies are taking advantage of the low wages and in some cases poor working conditions in these peripheral nations. So you've seen the good and the bad. With globalization, there are pros and there are cons. It does lead to greater profits for companies. It leads to increased employment in periphery nations. It can lead to international cooperation and expanded wealth, expanded GDP, expanded income. New markets open up for companies around the world. However, on the other hand, it can also lead to job losses in core nations. If companies are sending all their jobs to foreign countries, then workers within those countries where the jobs are leaving might suffer economically as they watch their jobs get passed along to workers from other countries. So that could be a negative. We also see the loss of vital resources for these periphery nations as they go back to those transnational corporations and oftentimes back to core countries. So that could be another downside of globalization. We also find a lot of environmental degradation as those resources are extracted from periphery countries where the regulations and standards for the environment are sometimes not quite what they would be in a core nation. It can degrade the environment. It can lead to pollution. Finally, sometimes globalization breeds nationalism. And with that, sometimes conflict. Not everyone believes that globalization is the future. Not everyone believes that globalization is necessarily improving their overall quality of life. So there's some good for globalization, there's some bad. It's your job to determine which of these outweighs the other. But that's all I have for you for today. Tomorrow, we are going to wrap up our final section of Unit 8 as we discuss sustainable development moving forward. All right, thank you as always for tuning in. I appreciate your time and effort and focus, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.